Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Mathern. I'm a board member of MHP, and I am here to kick us off this morning. And spoiler alert, there will be a request for donations at the end of this, so just start thinking about that now. We try to get you early when the coffee is just typing in. So Anne just painfully reminded me that I've been at the board of MHP for 9 years, and I was going to say something like, when I look around this room, I always love seeing all of these familiar faces and people who play such an important role in housing in Minnesota. But I do remember when I first started coming to events like this, and I didn't really know anybody, and it felt so intimidating, and now it feels so warm, and it feels so much that we're all sort of working at this together, when I think 9 years ago, if I had been asked to opine about what the climate would be like, both in terms of challenges here in Minnesota, national challenges, the political climate, the world climate, I would not have ever ventured to guess that it would be anything similar to what it is. So at the beginning, I would say, if you're sitting at a table with someone you don't know, introduce yourself. Because I think it is that closeness of this group that really is important, especially in these times. So we have a very exciting program this morning with a great panel to talk about housing preservation and the future of housing in Minnesota. And as you all know, this is such a vitally important conversation because it's not just about buildings, it's about keeping people in their homes. And it's about stability for working families. And it's about making sure communities can remain whole. And if we have so much unpredictability in the world, to have stability in one's own personal community and home can make the difference, and I know that we all feel that. So we know that this work is more urgent than ever across the country, and if you're in Minnesota, costs are increasing, public resources are stretched thin, or frankly, just not available, and the need for housing has never been clearer. And that's why conversations like today matter. We're fortunate to have national insight in the room, coupled with local leadership on these issues, to help us understand what it takes to meet this moment as a group and as an organization. But that conversation isn't enough. The work that MHP does, policy work, research, community development work, convening groups like this, that is all really important to help turn strategy into action. And in fact, Anne just told me that this week alone, all 5 of MHP's policy priorities have hearings at the Minnesota legislature in 1 week. I think that is a pretty incredible testament to the work that MHP does and being really at the center of the moment here in Minnesota, but also nationally. But we can't do the work alone. We can't do it in a vacuum without help from all of you. So that work continues to depend on people in this room and outside of it. You can make a gift today to MHP. You can increase your annual support. If you're an organization, you can consider becoming a donor to the Investor Circle, so this group that we're convening today. And you should know that every contribution at every level is very important to continuing MHP's work. So thank you so much for being here this morning. I will now turn it over to MHP Executive Director Anne to start the program.
Welcome. I love seeing a full room of interested folks and advocates in housing. Our speaker, when I was speaking to her previously, she was like, you have meetings so early in the morning. That do people really get up that early and show up? And I was like, yeah, here you are. So thank you so much for coming. We have a really great program today. As Erin was saying, and as all of you know, this issue of preservation and stabilization of housing is so critical to our continued ability to make sure everyone in Minnesota has a home. So that's what our focus will be today. And again, thank you so much for coming. So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. And I will note also on your table, there are little barcodes, scan codes that you can get the bios of all the speakers you can look at. And if you flip it around, you'll be able to contribute to MHP as well. So our keynote speaker is Priya Jayachandran, who is the CEO of the National Housing Trust. a nonprofit committed to the preservation of home, opportunity, and dignity through affordable housing. Since 2018, she has led NHT's engagement in public policy, lending, housing development, and energy sustainability. And prior to that, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for multifamily housing programs at HUD under President Obama. And there she guided national housing policy and program administration. And before that public service, she spent 15 years in community development, banking, leading teams in affordable housing finance and tax credit equity. She also previously led affordable housing development at Volunteers of America and has worked in international microfinance as well. So join me please today in welcoming our keynote speaker, Priya Jayachandran.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Anne and Elizabeth and the entire MHP team for inviting me. I couldn't be more thrilled to be here. I feel like the Washington metropolitan region where I'm based and Minnesota and the Twin Cities are kindred spirits. As long as I've been doing this work, we've often turned to Minneapolis and policymakers here for best practices at the state, and so many of your nonprofit affordable housing owners are peers that we learn from. The benefit of learning from Caroline Horton at Aon every day. She's on our board and such a mentor to me and so many in the field. So couldn't be more thrilled to be here. Anne suggested I start by positioning whether the challenges that so many in the Minneapolis and the Minnesota community are facing in their affordable housing preservation challenge. And for better or for worse, I will tell you, no, you're not alone. These are local and national challenges around the country. And the reality is that for the last, I would say, 40 years, as is true for a lot of American public policy, we've had a capital bias. Despite all of what we're reading about the supply challenges, which are real, we prefer to build things than to think about operating things. And that bias is coming back to bite us in a big way. And so we in the DMV region, it's often what is called the acronym for the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia region, are facing a lot of the same challenges you are. But let me take a step back for a moment and ground us on where we are. The organization I lead, National Housing Trust, was founded 40 years ago this year to focus on affordable housing preservation. At that time, the preservation challenge, as it's been for most of our existence, was largely focused on expiring affordability. Thinking about when, in the early 1990s, when we were created, a lot of that early affordable housing stock that was built and subsidized in the post-war boom years was reaching the end of its, call it 20, 30, or 40-year expiry. And as policymakers around the world since the beginning of time have been wont to do, they didn't think about what happens at the end of that. That's somebody else's problem. So in the early 90s, you were reaching some of that early expiration, and we were created to think about how do you preserve that affordability by thinking about how do you extend those affordability restrictions. So it was largely technical work. I would say clearly there are still challenges to expiring affordability, and I imagine a lot of you are familiar with qualified contract challenges and ROFR, right of first refusal challenges. But I would go so far as to say I think there's been a lot of progress made on that front. Sure, it still happens, and there are loopholes that can be closed. It would be wonderful to see that qualified contract eliminated in Section 42 of the tax code. But there's a lot more awareness, and HFAs and others are doing things like asking owners to waive their rights to exercising those rights on new projects, and a lot more information campaign. What I would argue is the next wave of preservation and the bigger threat are deteriorating conditions. And I would argue that we collectively, as affordable housing owners and operators, are slowly sinking under the weight of O&M, operations and maintenance costs. And it's not simply about inflation. Clearly, inflation has exacerbated it, but the reality is that we have no system for operations and maintenance of affordable housing. And we can ignore that usually for the first 15 or 20 years, because anyone who's owned a new building knows that we have a few less challenges in those early years. But as the age creeps up, so do the ongoing operations and maintenance needs, and we are slowly sinking into that quicksand. And I think what we're seeing, or the sad part is sometimes not seeing, is that we're slowly losing homes. We're gradually sinking, and homes and apartments are coming offline because they are inhabitable. The hard part is that data is really hard to capture. Whereas you have expiring affordability that's coded in LURAs and others, this is the silent crisis. Few of us track and keep data and share data on and we're not proud of it either. We don't want to advertise that we've got inhabitable units. And the reality is that most of us pride ourselves on achieving or striving for better than decent, safe, and sanitary. I know as an affordable housing owner we own about 3,000 affordable apartment homes. I would say 50% of them, if I'm being honest with you, we're not really proud to own. I wouldn't want them on the front page of the Washington Post and where I live. And the reality is that we just don't have the cash to maintain them. So Anne asked me not to be a Debbie Downer, which I clearly am ignoring, and to focus more on solutions than problems. So I'm going to try in a very quick way, because I'm cognizant of my time limit, to outline what I think are 5 potential solutions to the problem that I just spent the most time articulating. And then excited to have a conversation with colleagues around the table. So I'd say the first, I'm going to try and be both short-term solutions and longer-term solutions. In the short term, some of you who are old like me might remember after 2008, the federal government and HUD designed and implemented the Mark-to-Market program. And the idea behind the Mark-to-Market program was that there were a lot of properties and communities with debt loads they couldn't support. And so what the Market-to-Market program did was effectively resize the first mortgage debt to a supportable amount, and then create a second and potentially a third note of what were cash flow obligations and potentially forgivable. I think that there are a lot of properties around the country that no longer can support their debt. I know that we are in that position. We are on our 4th and last extension on a community that we can't convert to perm loan on because of rent collections and operating costs. We've got 95% physical occupancy, and 85% economic occupancy. And a lot of you know that to convert from construction to perm loan, most lenders require 90% economic occupancy for trailing 90 days. And so, and we don't see that happening for the next couple of years. So we're moving to the workout group of the bank that financed it. What could change that is a mark-to-market style program where we are able to resize that first mortgage debt. That would have to be a state and local solution where a state and local government creates that program to resize the first debt and create a forgivable or cash flow note for the second or third. I would argue that's in policy makers' best interest because it would keep that stock, and more importantly, I think this is what's often lost, it would keep the owners that are behind that. This is not just a crisis of properties, it is a crisis of the organizations that are behind those. And we have a lot of organizations around the country. You started to see it with Skid Row Housing Trust and Heartland Housing on the West Coast, but I think that those were really harbingers of what is to come around the country of organizations not being able to sustain the operating and maintenance costs of their portfolio. So that's really one solution for tackling the problem as is. How do we prevent this going forward? I would articulate 4 potential other solutions. The first is a shallow preservation tool. The reality right now is that we don't have a housing finance system. We have a single housing finance tool, and that is the low-income housing tax credit. And the reality is the low-income housing tax credit is a great tool, but that's what it is, it's a tool. We need a system, and what's the difference between a tool and a system? The difference is that very few of us have properties that all look the same or have the same needs. And if you're building a house, you think, okay, well, for this problem, I pull out my hammer. For this problem, I pull out my screwdriver. We have one tool that we apply to every problem we have. And it's a pretty, if you look at it from a taxpayer perspective, it's a pretty expensive tool. And when all the attention around the country is on our supply crisis, and that's real, we really need to think about how do we channel our deepest, most expensive subsidy to solving that deep supply crisis for new units and ones that need gut rehab. But I would argue that it's not the highest and best use to think about properties that are simply can't be maintained to use this really deep subsidy. And I think that we need a shallow subsidy, a tool that I would argue would save taxpayers money by thinking about how do we maintain properties? How do we have a low-cost capital solution to do that ongoing maintenance that is needed? You could argue, if you look at our market rate counterparts, that when they've got a leaky roof or they've got carpets that need to be replaced, they do it piecemeal as issues arise through cash flow. Well, many of us don't have that same cash flow, hence you do need a subsidy. But what we often do is wait 15 years because the system motivates you to save it all up and do this massive rehab, often more than is needed, for 15 years, and we let it deteriorate to a point where it's almost inhabitable. It would be so much better for everyone and cost effective to mirror our market rate housing counterparts and do the work piecemeal through low cost capital. The second, third, fourth, and fifth, suggestions are the third is rental assistance. Rental assistance is really the gold standard and the solution. LIHTC is a capital subsidy. It helps build and defray the costs. It doesn't help you on operating costs. And the reality is that particularly in serving low income and very low income residents, the operating costs are not, the rents do not support the operating costs. Rental assistance is a demand side subsidy as opposed to a supply side, and really meets renters where they are. And it is a win-win for renters and owners. I spoke to somebody in the UK recently who said that they are increasingly advocating for taking the present value of rental assistance to an upfront subsidy. It seems that around the world, people aren't trusting their lawmakers for long-term appropriations and obligations. Even if you get rental assistance today, few of us trust that that lawmaker 5 years from now is going to respect that obligation. And so people are saying, show me the money now. Convert that rental assistance, present value it to what it is today, and give me a bigger subsidy up front that I can put in the bank and then effectively use as rental assistance over time. I don't think many of us are holding our breath for the federal government passing that anytime soon, but you do see local governments around the country stepping up to offer rental assistance. And I know you all have some in Minnesota examples. We in the DC have something called the Local Rent Supplement Program. They're small, but I think that rental assistance really does work. The other is, going back to my banking days, thinking about underwriting standards. I don't think many of us are realistic in our underwriting, whether on the owner side or on the lender side, about what operations cost and what we have that capital bias. So we'll take a property and we'll figure out what the cash flow can support at whatever your debt service coverage is, let's say 115, and we'll say, okay, it can support $60,000 a door in rehab. Boom, we're going to do $60,000 a door in rehab. That isn't compared to just the smell test of looking around and saying, is this what it needs? What if it needs $80,000? Well, it can't support $80,000, so we're going to do $60,000. We are increasingly seeing that those underwriting decisions are coming back to haunt us. We let the capital decision guide everything about it, as opposed to saying, what does the real estate tell us? What does common sense tell us? And sometimes it means maybe not doing something or walking away from it if the capital, what it can support, isn't sufficient. Because a few years down the road, those decisions come back to haunt us. And then the final solution is something modeled on a very technical HUD code and policy, Section 8BB. Section 8BB allows project-based Section 8 subsidy to be ported or transferred from one property to the other. And the reality is, and I know this is the history of our organization and our advocacy, as preservationists, we've had the attitude that preservation at all costs. We will hold on to properties wherever they are, and we will, housing is, and subsidized housing is better than no housing at all. And I think what we've realized over the past 5 years is that honestly, because of decisions that people made years ago and frankly discriminatory practices, a lot of affordable housing is set up to fail. It is in areas of concentrated poverty, it was poorly built, it was poorly designed, and there's very little that can be done to improve it. And the reality is that I think we have to be a little bit more honest with ourselves and say, are we helping anyone? We own a 100% Section 8 community in east of the river in Washington, D.C., 92 units, where 100% of the people are on the wait list for a voucher. Embarrassingly, no one wants to live there. There is gun violence. It was a 1960-style development at the end of a dead-end street. Nothing ever good happens at the end of a dead-end street. Set back from the street with a big open parking lot and a garden-style building, and that open parking lot has become a hotbed of crime. Not for residents, but people run in there, end of dead-end street. There's very little that we can do to improve that. Even if we were to tear it down, honestly, if I were a policymaker, I would say, I don't know that it's worth the $30 million of subsidy. That's what it would take. $30 million of subsidy. It would be over $100 million to rebuild it. It's not the best choice. The better solution would be to take that subsidy and move it elsewhere. And I think that that's been both on policymakers, but also on the affordable housing community. We have an attitude of we want to do deals and we want to save units, and I don't think that we've always been commonsensical about it. So I think that as I look at the preservation challenges and the solutions, I think it's a combination of short-term fixes, long-term new tools, doubling down on what works, rental assistance, and being a bit more realistic and clear-eyed in our own approach on underwriting and where subsidy makes sense to get us to a better place, and a system that works both for building as well as for operating. Thank you.
Priya got the assignment, and I wanted to hear about solutions, so thank you. Why don't I'd love to invite the panel up. So we can join us up here. Oh, that's great. There we go. So that's a lot of, I really appreciate, and many of you who know me know that I am always wanting to do solution-based. I spent years doing presentations about the state of housing in Minnesota and would leave the room and you could just feel like people were just like, oh no. And but we have solutions. We do have solutions, and thank you for outlining many of those. So I'm gonna have a conversation with some of our panelists here today, and again, their bios are on your table, and you can scan code the bios as well, and with the scan code on your table as well. And as we go through some of the questions, I'm inviting all our panelists to say a couple words about your organization and sort of how you're engaged in this as well. So Dan, I thought I would start with you. When Priya started her presentation, just sort of touching on sort of what's happening nationally, we feel it very personally here in Minnesota, but we know that this is not unique, and you have a sort of lens on the market in Minnesota and beyond. And so, Dan, why don't you just introduce yourself and US Bank, and then talk a little bit about that market lens.
So my name's Dan Smith. I work in the Affordable Housing Group at US Bank, which is the group that buys low-income housing tax credits and finances through debt projects that use low-income housing tax credits. I was also an MHP board member for 9 years, so been to many of these. It's a great organization. Thanks for having me. I'm going to pile on a little more doom and gloom. I recognized when Priya told some of her horror stories, those resonated with me on things we've seen in our portfolio nationwide. And I think maybe first talk a little bit about what's going on in the equity markets right now. I think Priya accurately described it as the only tool. I'm not a handy person, so I only have one of those tools that you buy for $8 at the hardware store, and it's got a screwdriver and some other things I don't know what they are. So I like that. I like that analogy. But our tool is there's good news in the long term. We probably all know about the tax bill last year expanded the credit. So that's good. And I think in like 5 years, the investor market will have absorbed all that and it'll be great. But between now and whenever that happens, there aren't new investors aren't coming into the market fast enough to buy those additional credits, and so pricing is dropping, and so the tool's a little less valuable than it was. I think pricing might have been 85 cents a year ago. It's like 78 cents now. So those capital stacks for all of us who do deals are getting tighter in that way.
And just one quick follow-up on that. How does Minnesota's pricing compare to sort of what you're seeing elsewhere?
So I would say it's probably right in the middle. I think Minnesota's viewed still relatively as a stable place. I think there are some markets right now that are overbuilt, that we're seeing vacancies in the Southwest, the Southeast, the Mountain West. So I think investors are concerned about investing in those markets. I think the one thing that makes Minnesota, whereas in Minnesota, I think things are relatively more stable. It's hard to build here, as probably everybody knows, and so we certainly haven't gotten into an overbuilt situation. I would say on the tricky side for Minnesota is the permanent supportive housing. I think we have more of those deals than other MSAs of our size. There are the requirements to get a tax credit allocation. I think you have to include long-term homeless. It helps. So that makes it tricky. It's not impossible. We had a call on this a few months ago with some of the policymakers, and I don't describe it as a flight to quality. I describe it more as a flight to easy. So if you think, right now I can invest anywhere I want. But people are calling us. People who we used to be friends with, haven't heard from in 6 years, are calling us now looking for investments. So, we can invest anywhere, and if over here is easier than Minnesota with the requirements, it's just easier to do the deal somewhere else.
Thank you. Well, you're talking about this. I'm going to turn to you next, Scott. Since you were the former budget director of St. Paul, and I consider you one of the sort of whizzes in really understanding these operational challenges. So maybe you can introduce yourself and maybe also touch on a little bit of the Housing Stability Coalition, which of course Scott, Chris, and Leanne are all a part of in MHP as well, that's really focused on how do we make sure this whole sector of providers has the ability to respond to these challenges. Scott?
Great. So, good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Cordes, Chief Operating Officer at Project for Pride and Living. Project for Pride and Living is a Twin Cities-based affordable housing developer, owner, operator. About a third of our units are supportive housing, and we have a lot of old stuff and a lot of new stuff. And so, Priya, I just want to say I feel like I stole your notes and are going to inadequately replicate it. So you were very much on point, and I think said a lot of really smart things. So just really quickly about the Minnesota Housing Stability Coalition. So this is a coalition. I think many of you in this room are part of it, but many who aren't part of it know it. It came into existence, I think, officially in late 2023. It's made up of a combination of owners, operators, supportive housing providers, and various housing intermediaries. And our focus really is on the sustainability of housing preservation and operations. And so our legislative agenda reflects that accordingly. And I can't remember if you said, do you want me to talk about solutions?
Absolutely.
Yes, that's where I'm going. I have too many things going on in my head at the same time. So one of the things, and again, a lot of this isn't all that dissimilar from what Priya said at the national level, but we actually know a lot about what our challenges are, I think, as an industry and as a group of operators. And I'll start with supportive housing. Dan talked about supportive housing and some of the challenges there. We're building a lot of supportive housing. We're putting a lot of supportive housing units online. But the funding to operate, as Priya talked about really well, doesn't always follow. And so I think especially in policymaker or elected officials' minds, it's like you build the capital asset and you solve problems. In supportive housing, you really now need those operating dollars to go with it. So that's a challenge. We need more capital. We need to build more, but we also need more capital for preservation. The regulatory environment in Minnesota, I think, is really challenging, both on the land use side as well as the regulatory environment for operators. And so we have operating challenges, and we need more flexibility to address those, and it's really hard, but also really necessary. Master of the obvious statement, but the federal government's not helping, and so we have to address that, and we can address that. And when I get to solutions here in a second, I'll talk a little bit about that. And the other thing is the low-income housing tax credit. It is an imperfect tool, but it's the tool that we have, and Dan talked about pricing. Pricing has deteriorated. It makes deals harder. The other thing that has happened is more risk is being pushed onto the owner-operators, both in terms of when things like developer fees get paid out, get backloaded to the back end, converting to permanent financing, Priya talked about. All those things have gotten harder with higher thresholds to be able to get the building initially stable when a new building is built. So what are we going to do about this? The good news is I think there's actually attainable things that we can get done even in this legislative session. And there's a lot, I think, that we can do outside of the legislative process as well. And so this year, this legislative session, there's three things that I think are on the table, have had hearings or are going to have hearings this week that I actually think, especially in light of the forecast on Friday, the budget forecast, gives me some hope that we can get some things done. So some of you have heard about the Sustain the Gain supportive housing initiative, basically an effort to capture housing stabilization services funding that had been appropriated at the state level as a match to Medicaid to be able to backstop the supportive housing system with federal cuts to COC grants that we're experiencing. $9 million of that has passed through the House Ways and Means Committee already, and there's a real chance that the short-term part of that solution could happen immediately, and the larger part of that solution may be happening by the end of the session. The Yes to Home land use regulation effort that's been underway for at least 3 years now. Small steps, but there's an opportunity there with bipartisan support to get something done on land use and zoning regulation. And then housing infrastructure funds. I think we've been really good in the state about investing in that capital source. And I think there's a real chance to get that passed as well. Outside of the legislative session, I'll wrap up here. The other thing that I think that we need to just do a better job in Minnesota is actively collaborating between funders, operators, elected officials, and advocates to make sure that we're aligned on what the problems are, but also making it easier to solve problems. Sometimes as operators, we see it as we put information into the machine, often what I'm describing as the funder's machine, and it outspits an answer. And the challenges we have are too complex and too unique by project to not have a lot of dialogue to get there. So I think we can do that. And I'll say some other things for later, but I'm excited about the possibilities that we can accomplish here in the new.
So all three of you providers are so focused on permanent supportive housing. And so I want to talk, as we think about operating costs, there's the building cost, but there's the people cost too, to support the folks who are living in these buildings. And Priya, I want to ask you, and then I'm going to turn to Leanne to sort of talk about sort of what that really means on the ground in serving people well. But talk a little bit about how that service funding side of permanent supportive housing gets funded across the country in different ways. And because I know that's one of the disconnects as we try to operate projects here where we're committing, I always think of it as a uncomfortable marriage where we have a building that never moves with 30, 40 year commitments and people who are moving constantly and usually get 1 to 2 year service funding contracts to serve them. And that's a hard fit. What are you seeing across the country on how you sustain that?
I think permanent supportive housing providers across the country are struggling. I think many of us watched what happened to Skid Row Housing Trust in Los Angeles and can empathize. I think what made them unique is that 100% of their portfolio was PSH. I think most people realize that that is really hard to do, and so that more organizations haven't followed their trajectory is because they've got some diversification. I think a lot of organizations around the country right now are defending the continuum of care and for obvious reasons. But I don't think that we are, if we get past this, that system doesn't work particularly well either. And so I think being honest about what is the future of homeless services, and many of you maybe saw that New York Times article a couple months ago about the Utah experiment and going from not a housing first model to big transitional housing. I think, it was on some ways upsetting. On the other, the reality is that a lot of the housing first hasn't produced the results. I'm not questioning the model, but I think we have to be honest about the implementation and what is the right mix, because, and I think we all know that it's got to be a service funding, and service obligation is not a housing expense. That is separate from a real estate obligation, and you need healthcare dollars or another source of income that has been kind of elusive for as long as I've been doing this work.
And love that we are being challenged on a lot of levels about some of the work that we've been doing. So thank you for being provocative. Leanne, I want to turn to you a little bit on grounding us both in the why that we're doing this work, but then what you're seeing is those challenges, particularly in permanent supportive housing. And just want to thank Leanne too, coming down from Duluth for this event to join us today, and as the executive director of the American Indian Community Housing Organization, has a unique lens on this. Leanne?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Yeah, my name is Leanne Littlewolf, and I'm executive director for ACO. And in Duluth, we have 29 units of permanent supportive housing. So it's a smaller number as far as units, but I can say that, we have eligibility of long-term homeless, chronic homeless, and individuals with disabling conditions, right? Which is like kind of standard. But when we have households come into our program, if they're struggling like we're struggling as far as trying to find the cash flow, and if they're not able to stay in our program, what they do is they're going to go back onto the priority list and they're going to look for another permanent supportive housing program. So we're just shuffling people around. So it's really in our best interest to help people, once they get into housing, to stay and to get some stability. So what we've been doing is we partner other kinds of programming, and we're able to get other grant funds for that kind of programming. So, but it's a lot to maintain. I mean, it's a lot to coordinate as far as like administratively. But we have a traditional health program we have a traditional healing program that puts on group activities on a regular basis, community activities, and then we use our program to build community space and community belonging. I think we do that, and we also have a health which is focused on recovery. So recovery from could be substance use, it could be building mental health stability or like health, and then it could be also recovery from trauma. So we focused a lot on a trauma-informed approach. So our staff are trained on that, and we try to have all of our activities based in that. So we're lucky that we're able to partner with other funders that support those initiatives. We also look at basic needs and try to figure ways to build those resources. And now we're leaning into like how do you build generational wealth. And I think a couple of years ago we were super excited about that. Now because all of the current status, now we're just looking at like how do we maintain what we have and how do we weather what's coming. And we're concerned about the challenges that are coming from the federal government and also the budget concerns that we have with the state budget. So as far as the way we work with the permanent supportive housing, one of our goals is safety. And so we have to maintain a safe environment because our residents have had a lot of like unsafe situations in their life. They've lived through a lot of like dangerous things. And so building safety is critical. And so we have we have 24-hour staff. We take building safety like to the extreme. And so we have to make sure that we can afford all of that staffing. And then we also have voluntary supportive services, which we don't have that every year permanent funding for. We have to raise money for that every year. So it makes it really precarious for our workers who also are working to survive and to thrive, and they're building their own financial stability. So we're a community, and I think in greater Minnesota, Duluth is a small urban area, but I've worked across northern Minnesota, and it takes longer to build a permanent supportive housing program or supportive housing or affordable housing. And so if we lose it, it's devastating to our community. And so I'm really interested in this conversation about how do we maintain that permanency.
Thank you. Chris, Priya had some challenging framework about having a portfolio with a lot of permanent supportive housing. Maybe you can introduce Beacon and for that context, and then tell us sort of from your lens.
Yeah, I had a deep exhale moment listening to Priya. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris LaCondres. I'm the president and CEO of Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative. And also, I've been in the role for just a couple of years now. Before that, I was a Hennepin County Commissioner, where I served as the chair of our Housing and Redevelopment Authority and one of two commissioners on Heading Home Hennepin, which is a continuum of care that interfaces around steering federal investments on homelessness solutions. I currently lead Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative, which is one of the state's largest providers of permanent supportive housing. In fact, we serve over 1,500 residents across our 24 properties, and over 75% of that is permanent supportive housing. So we are in the deep end of the supportive housing pool, and we are struggling to keep our head above the water, candidly. And I say that not for any concern for Beacon or even supportive housing providers, but the community impact if we're not doing our jobs and if we're not adequately resourced to do it. So the environment that we're operating in right now, and I'll go to challenges and solutions, is pretty clear. And I'll actually start with where we're strong. Thanks to Minnesota Housing Partnership, and thanks to all of you for being here today. The fact that this many people are in a room having this conversation right now is a testament to the strength of our affordable housing ecosystem here in the state of Minnesota. Invisibly and not in this room, all throughout our community, we have quietly and without much fanfare over decades built one of the largest, most resilient, innovative, and effective permanent supportive housing systems anywhere in the nation. We're probably over-indexed on that here, as Dan said, because we care and because state and local governments have paired with federal investments to prioritize this. So we've built something extraordinary here. Yeah, round of applause. It's been built up over decades across Republican and Democratic administrations, and it has taken decades to build. And in the coming months, and this is no hyperbole, it could unravel around us, what has taken decades to build, through a combination of a few factors. Rising community need on housing and homelessness, real financial and operational distress among providers that are holding these proven solutions, even before anything federally was happening. I mean, the Housing Stability Coalition, we commissioned a report on this. And it showed that for every unit of permanent supportive housing in our ecosystem, just in the past 5 years, the operating costs have changed by $2,000 per unit, cost $2,000 per unit more. None of that's baked into the operating assumptions of these deals, none of it. It's all being passed to providers in terms of unsustainable investments or mission trade-offs that are eroding and deteriorating the quality of the care that we're able to provide in our properties. And that was before this moment, and I'm going to steal language here from our neighbor to the north, Prime Minister Mark Carney, this moment of not transition, but rupture as it relates to how our ecosystem relates to the federal government. I will bring to the center of this conversation what's mentioned already, this HUD continuum of care discussion. It really does represent, HUD's actions represent a code red, a 5-alarm fire, a retreat from decades of bipartisan progress on proven solutions to homelessness. And the impact extraordinary. I mean, HUD is trying to reprogram $3.5 billion in federal funding for homelessness, which if you think about what makes this work, and I'll transition to solutions here in a second, Ann, because I think it opens up the conversation more broadly. Any unit of supportive housing, you got to think of it like a Jenga tower. Right? It's strong with all the bricks in there, but those bricks include federal, state, local, and community investments. And you start monkeying with any one of those bricks and the whole tower can topple over. And right now we're seeing all the federal bricks kicked out. And so this is the transition and sort of the, I'm a dad, I've got 2 boys, we love Star Wars. We're entering our Star Wars era. In A New Hope, there's this, help me Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope moment. The action in this moment, and we didn't ask for it, Minnesota, but this is where we are, in a moment of federal transition and rupture, inevitably, it will be up to the state and our local governments to decide how much of what we have built we will maintain and how much we will let unravel around us. But understand that is the choice we are making right now in this moment. And to your point, Priya, about tools, yeah, the federal tools are limited, and they're not going to solve this in the next 12 months, let alone the next 10 years for us. The action is going to have to be at a state and local level. Scott talked about some of the state legislative agenda. We are also operating in a time where at a local government level, at least here in the 7-county metro area, through the creation of LAHA, the local affordable housing aid, the quarter-cent sales tax. In fact, at a time of seeming housing scarcity, we actually have more public resource, more housing abundance in our community right now than ever before, moving through our cities and counties. But we need to decide how many of those resources are going to go to a robust affordability preservation agenda broadly. And I would say a great place to start with that logic would be making sure that our permanent supportive housing system doesn't unravel around us in the coming months, and that we protect what we built. Because it actually, this is the last thing I'll say, it has been effective. In Hennepin County alone, in the past 5 years, we've reduced unsheltered homelessness by 35%. We've moved 9,500 people from homelessness to housing. In Minnesota, in 86 of 87 counties, we have functionally ended veterans' homelessness. That's because of these investments. So are we going to let that unravel, or are we going to protect it? That's the question.
I think that the veterans' homelessness is a good example, but what's unique about veterans' homelessness are the VASH vouchers, right? That you get vouchers. In my mind, that is the direct linkage between why veterans homelessness has been a victory across the country. And if we just took that solution and replicated it, I think we could do, this homelessness crisis would look very different. But the continuum of care is not the same as housing vouchers for all.
Leanne, do you want to talk a little bit about the strategies through our Future Starts at Home to actually resource some of these solutions, particularly rental assistance, and that I know you've been a leader in that.
Well, I mean, we have an opportunity to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and we can all do that. We just need them to put it, we just need the legislature to put it on the ballot. And it would be like 3/8 of a cent. And we've done this, we've done a constitutional amendment like this for the arts and culture, and I think it was like sports. There was like three different groups that were together, and we've had it for the last like 20 plus years. And it's been effective to fund those state resources or those state activities. And we need to have that kind of commitment for our housing, you know, and the amendment is put together. It's, there'd be citizens that would help with the decisions around what it funds, but it focuses on like prevention and home ownership and also services. And we need that investment that's long-standing, you know, for our state. So I know that there's a hearing today at 12:30 at the Senate. So I think it's really important to really support that amendment and find out. And there's been it's a great coalition. And there's a web page that lays out everything. So I think to get everyone to get educated on that and get involved with that is critical.
One of the solutions, thank you, one of the solutions, Priya, that you talked about was rental assistance specifically. And I know that through that constitutional amendment, dedicated revenue for housing strategy would set aside a minimum of $100 million of whatever is raised, probably something in the range of $500 million, specifically for rental assistance on that. On another one of your strategies, and Dan, I want to turn to you, and Scott, you might have opinions about this as well. You had mentioned the mark-to-market program and having these more shallow subsidies targeted. I'm less familiar with it, Dan. I don't know if you have used that in the past. What do you think about something like that, or other similar solutions?
So I think the mark-to-market program, most of the deals we see with the mark-to-market program contain large rent increases with Section 8 contracts. We feel pretty good about underwriting those. I mean, you can find some people who worry about the long-term viability of Section 8. You know, if you really were worried about that, you probably would never do a deal. So anyway, I think the shallow subsidies, I really liked what Priya said. I mean, we have some instances, you mentioned the deal where you were coming up a little short on the conversion. You know, I think when we see situations that turn from problems into train wrecks, it's usually for the lack of a relatively small amount of money. And if your sponsor is under stress, and is, you know, I'll make up numbers, is $1 million short of converting into a $10 million perm loan. They don't have $1 million because they have problems all over their portfolio. One of the bad parts about our tool are all the people involved. So to restructure a deal, I mean, I used to say I'd rather negotiate Mideast peace, maybe not today, but than try to restructure a LIHTC deal. It takes so long. So if there was a sort of a quick source that could sensibly say, we're going to spend $1 million and, you know, protect, you know, $20 or $30 million of investment, that would be really helpful. So I really like that idea.
I know I've said this before, probably in this room, but when you're reminding me that when I did this deal with Beacon, 66 West apartments, 39 apartments, and we had 14 different sources that needed to come to closing, and we talked about it as herding cats, and every cat had a lawyer. So it just makes it a little more complicated to get there. So we're just about at time. I want to make sure that we have an opportunity if there's any other sort of solution-focused comments.
I have one more thing that I insisted I was going to say, and I haven't said it yet. Sponsors pay back loans. That's something I learned early in my banking career. And so focusing on keeping the sponsors healthy is critical. Those true train wrecks, Priya mentioned Skid Row and Heartland. I had maybe a second row seat to those. And the impact that a failed organization has is just massive. And so another sort of ounce of prevention, pound a cure. If you can keep, I'm don't want to speak specifics, but if you can keep that sponsor going, they're obviously going to think of the things Leanne said her organization's doing at that site. No one else is going to come in and do that. If you've got an apartment building that goes bad, you can sell it to somebody else. If you've got a supportive housing project that goes bad, no one else is going to come in other than the sponsor that is living it and breathing it.
Lightning round on last thoughts. Yes, Scott.
Yeah, just another thought that I don't think has come up yet. And Dan, thanks for saying what you just said. I think it's exactly right that a little bit goes a long way. And the difference between a successful story and a not successful story is less money than you think. And one of the themes that that's been, I think, true across every speaker today is there's a misalignment right now between the public investment that goes into the system and the expectations of the system to deliver. And so we see this as operators all the time, is that we're carrying risk or we're carrying expectations that the math doesn't support. And so as we think about solutions and we think about preservation and we think about regulation, ensuring that we're keeping that in mind, I think is going to be really important going forward.
Thank you. Chris, any?
Yeah, three things very briefly. Number one, we need to find a clear prioritization logic for LAHA, local affordable housing aid, with a focus on preservation and in particularly protecting the most important part of our ecosystem for our neighbors exiting homelessness, because if we don't serve them well, it doesn't serve all of us well. Number two, those resources are made possible by a sales tax. It's only in the 7-county metro area, so it only benefits the 7-county metro area. We need a statewide sales tax on affordable housing in Minnesota. If it's going to happen, it's going to be the people in this room who helped lead that movement. Thanks to MHP for putting this into a campaign. Our future starts with home. We need those, especially at a time of federal retreat and rupture. We need more flexible state and local resources for a wide array of needs here. That's going to take probably a few years to get done, but if all of us push on that, I think we can make it happen. And it's important because that becomes, as it has with LAHA, statewide, could be a really flexible source of dollars for rental assistance. And in supplementing that really important, those really limited federal resources for rental support with resources of our own.
Leanne?
Yeah, I saw that we had a slide up here with the home ownership rates, and I don't know if anyone saw that, but it was by race. And that was a slide that I looked for like probably 6 or 7 years, trying to find like data on I wanted to know how many Native people owned homes in Minnesota. And I kept asking all these sources, like, do you have that information? And then I read this report from Minnesota Department of Health, and they were focusing on American Indian health, and they had all the social economic data. And so when I found that slide, I was like, that explains a lot. There's like, for Black homeowners in Minnesota, it's at 25%. When I saw that, I am appalled by that. Native American was like 48, 49%, but you can see that there's racial disparities in that. And I think we need to look at those issues and in with our permanent supportive, and we have to start thinking bigger around like when people come into permanent supportive housing, we need a stronger path to home ownership with the families. When I was 19, I lived in a subsidized rental housing, community, and I started a resident council. It had never been done in my community, and it was powerful. I mean, we had all our residents come to meetings, and we talked about what our issues were. And when we started, it was like little issues like, hey, my neighbor keeps leaving like dead batteries in his yard. But you got to start there and build up to what the issues are. But we have to have people whose lives are impacted by this in this conversation. I will also say that when I moved from the Iron Range down to Duluth. There was a program that helped people that needed subsidized housing also save money to get to home ownership. But because I was on a tribal employment program, I got disqualified. But as a young person, I would own a home now. I don't own a home. So I figure how do you get these programs to connect with people's lives and to give these opportunities? And we need to have more thinking around that. And that's for ACO, that's the direction that we're going. But at the same time, we have to make sure that our property, we have rental units, we have to make sure that we can maintain, and we have a long-term commitment, not only to those units, but to our community members. So that's what I'll end with.
Thank you. Priya, you get the last word. Yeah, you've heard a lot about what's happening in Minnesota and the challenges. I appreciate the lens up from the national perspective and sort of how Minnesota fits and compares to that. Any last thoughts? Advice for us?
Our national budget or our state budget isn't just a budget. It's a reflection of our values and priorities. And if you look at least at the national level, we're putting a lot of priority on war and defense and certain obligations. And what we spend on housing is, as a percentage of the national budget, has been a linear trajectory downward. And I think we've become, as housers, apologists. We make excuses when we have to subsidize something. We subsidize all of our national priorities, and I think too much of the housing conversation has become about no-cost solutions. Everyone's looking for regulatory reform and zoning, and those are all great, but there's a reason that everyone's excited about them. They don't cost anything, and I think we have to become a little bit more bullish on saying, yes, it costs something to do rental assistance, and that is a good investment because it reflects the country and the values that we want to espouse.
Thank you for that. That is an excellent place to land this. I just want to say to all of the panelists, thank you so much for leaning in and bringing your expertise into this. Should we give another round for the panelists? And clearly we have work together that's impacting all of our organizations in different ways. I am very inspired by both. Thank you for following the memo on the solutions based. We have solutions that we can implement to address this. And I think the power of everyone in this room collectively is how we get there. So thank you for leaning in with us and waking up early this morning for the conversation. I want to quickly say a thank you. MHP staff has been so helpful in setting all this up. A big thank you to all of you. And I have been reminded also that the flowers on each table, you guys can, wrestle it out, who's ever at the table, but you can take those flowers home with you. And thank you again for supporting this work and supporting MHP and collectively solving these challenges. Thanks.
Everybody's going,